A couple of faces of victims who attended our earlier presentation. Thank you for your resilience. This is going to be even more fun. Our own Paweł Styrna will try to psychoanalyze the Kremlin, as in the building. So brace yourselves and have fun.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Probably most of the people here are just enjoying the air-conditioned space, but but I'll try to make this as fun and exciting as possible, even though the topic is, well, a bit morbid and sad. But anyhow, the topic, the Besieged Kremlin complex, how post-Soviet Russia's leadership views the world, originally germinated as an article topic. Someone sent me via email a link to an article, interview with Nikolai Patrushev, who was the head of the FSB from 1999-2008, one of Vladimir Putin's main deputies, who said, who basically claimed that the U.S. was attempting to use the crisis in Ukraine to undermine, subvert, and ultimately dismember Russia. And I was asked, would you like to write an article about this? And first I figured, well, this is deja vu. This is typical for the Kremlin, typical mentality among Moscow's leadership. So then I thought about it some more, and I figured, actually, this does deserve an article, because I don't think that in the West we really understand this besieged Kremlin mentality very well. So, and because we do not understand it, we have very smart people like Professor John Mearsheimer, who I respect very much as a scholar, and with whom I agree on a lot of issues, but not on the Ukraine-Russia issue. A few months ago, Professor Mearsheimer published an article alleging that the whole Ukraine crisis was the fault of the West for allegedly encroaching upon Russia's natural sphere of influence in Ukraine and implying that the West should have known better. So, of course, Dr. C wrote a great rebuttal of this, and if you peruse the IWP website, you will find it. It's short and succinct, so I highly recommend it. And I have a few slides here, about 6 slides, which I'll be flipping back and forth through to make a few points. But let me circle around and read to you the Patrushev quote. Let me quote it to you in its entirety so that you understand the gist of this mentality. So this was in an interview in the Rossiyskaya Gazeta, published on February 11th of this year. And this is what Mr. Patrushev said, quote, "The situation in Ukraine is being used as a pretext for the active repression of our country. The Americans are trying to involve the Russian Federation in an interstate military conflict, cause regime change, and ultimately dismember our country via events in Ukraine. The U.S. administration expects its recent anti-Russian measures to decrease the quality of life for the population, give rise to mass protests, and push Russian citizens to overthrow the current government using the scenario of the color revolutions." End quote. Patrushev also threatened that, quote, "In today's difficult times, when the U.S. and its allies have taken the path of confrontation with the Russian Federation, it is necessary to recall again and again the lesson of history." Further alleging that, quote, "The rebirth of Nazism in the Baltics and Ukraine is occurring with the connivance of Europe and even the incitement of the U.S." End quote. So, this is the sort of attitude that permeates the leadership of post-Soviet Russia today in their attempt to rebuild the empire. And this is basically what I dedicated a 5-page article to back in March. And this lecture is mostly based on that article. However, I will elaborate on a few points, and I'll also add a few things. So I'm not simply rehashing my article, but I'm building upon it. Now, an example of the besieged Kremlin mindset. This is a graphic that was translated into English, originally circulated on the Russian internet, alleging the U.S. attempts by the U.S. and NATO to encircle Russia. So you see basically satellites monitoring and targeting Russia from above. You see attempts to encircle Russia from the west, from the south, and from the east, from every direction. And here you have another graphic which has been circulated by Westerners more so, I believe, although its provenance is probably Russian. Putin actually said something, made a statement about this, I think, 2 weeks ago or so, claiming that it's the U.S. and its allies that are really the aggressors in the world because of all the U.S. bases throughout the world. And I've seen this graphic shared on social networks, including Facebook, so many times that, especially by circles that are either pro-Russian or simply anti-intervention. So everyone from libertarians to liberals to paleo-conservatives, pretty much anyone and everyone who either supports Putin and Russia for one reason or another, or that simply doesn't want to get involved. And obviously the pattern that is implied here is a pattern of encirclement. But if you think about it some more, all these American bases throughout the world are more so the result of the host countries actually desiring them and wanting an American presence, including to protect them from Russia, China, and other rapacious powers, and also Islamic Republic of Iran towards the south. So if it looks like a pattern of encirclement, then that's more of a question of geography than it is of actual intentional encirclement. Now, what are the roots of this mentality? Usually, analysts and policy wonks don't like to delve much into history, but I think that it's actually indispensable to go back not just to Soviet times and not just even to Imperial Russian times, but to go back in history to the beginnings of Russian and Ruthenian statehood to understand what the powers that be in the Kremlin are really thinking. Now, basically the mentality that I'm talking about here is often, if at all, the commentators delve into history, usually I think they take the easy way out, the path of least resistance, and usually just chalk it up to the factor of orthodoxy, or in particular, Third Romism, or Third Rome. Now, in a way, the Kremlin encirclement propaganda is rooted in the empire's Muscovite Orthodox exceptionalism. So there is a lot of truth to this, to the Third Rome theory, but I don't think that by itself it explains everything, and I'll elaborate on that later on. Although what it does explain is the sort of feeling of exceptionalism. Vladimir Putin may dislike American exceptionalism as allegedly arrogant, but the Russians have rarely been humble about their country's perceived place in the world. Those who have read Russian history are no doubt familiar with this notion of Third Rome, an early 16th century idea developed by the monk Philotheus, or Filofey in Russian, of Pskov, in a letter to the Grand Prince of Moscow, Basil III, which described Muscovy as the rightful heir of the Roman and Byzantine empires. Filofey wrote, "Two Romes have fallen, the third stands, and there will be no fourth. No one shall replace your Christian tsardom." End quote. Thus, the ideology of Third Rome expressed a xenophobic kind of exceptionalism wherein Muscovy stood as Orthodoxy's sole and final bastion of defense against its enemies, i.e. both the Muslims to the south and the quote-unquote Latins, or Catholics, to the west. However, this besieged Kremlin worldview cannot be attributed solely to Orthodoxy. The princes of Kievan Rus, Ruthenia, maintained decent relations with Catholic Europe even after the schism of 1054 when the Byzantine Church split off from Rome. However, the characteristic virulent hostility towards the West, even more intense than that against the Mongols and Muslims, became the ideological touchstone of the Muscovite tsardom that emerged out of the Mongol yoke, which lasted for almost 3 centuries in northeastern Rus. So here we have the Mongol factor. And what this illustration shows is the Mongol leaders feasting on a wooden platform while suffocating the princes of Rus under the platform after the Battle of Kauka River in 1223. That was the first contact between the Mongols and the people of Rus, actually. And the Mongol force that actually invaded was basically more of a reconnaissance force than anything else. It was not a main invasion army. So the main invasion actually came in the late 1230s, so about 12, 14 years after the Battle of Kauka River, which interestingly took place near Mariupol today, near the Sea of Azov. There's a rather small river there called Kauka River, so quite near the theater of war that is raging today. I think this illustration really says a lot about the impact of the Mongols on Rus, because the Mongols did was basically impose a brutal, bloody yoke on the principalities of Rus and taught the Ruthenian princes, especially in the northeast, where the state of Muscovy was eventually born, to be as cruel as possible. This happened in a way, it happened through negative selection, because every Ruthenian prince had to venture to Sarai, where to the encampment of the great Han, which was near the Volga River today in the steppes, to obtain his yarwyk. The yarwyk was sort of a certificate or permission to rule his kingdom, or his principality actually. He had to pass between 2 fires, which was a nomadic custom, and prostrate himself in front of the Han, and promise to deliver everything from slaves to tribute to the Han. And basically the rulers that emerged, the Ruthenian and later Muscovite rulers that emerged, were the emulators of the Hans. So their philosophy of statecraft was basically underpinned by the idea that that terror and fear are much more successful than love or any other kind of factor in ruling one's population. So when Machiavelli was writing around 1500 that it is better for a ruler to be feared than to be loved, well, this was something that the Mongols had instilled in the Ruthenians and the Muscovites at least a century, 2 centuries before. Now, there's also the Soviet factor behind the mentality that informs the current Kremlin regime, which is pretty obvious if you think about it, because the leaders of post-Soviet Russia were basically the leaders of the KGB, including Patrushev and Putin. They served in the KGB, and they're rather nostalgic especially about the imperial elements of the Soviet past. And well, they are the children of that system. So they absorbed a lot of its siege mentality. And finally, another factor is Moscow's grievances versus reality, which this is a very interesting graphic because I don't think you can read it, but it basically it's a commentary on it's basically a commentary on language policy in Ukraine. So the person, the large corpulent gentleman if you can call him a gentleman, on the left, dressed in Russian colors, says to the lady, the little girl sitting to the right, says, "Girl, move over. You're really getting into my space. You're crowding my space." So this person here represents Russia and the Russian language, and the young girl is supposed to represent Ukraine, the Ukrainian language, in this Ukrainian cartoon, although I would say that this is actually this applies not only to that particular situation, but also applies to Russia's dealings with its neighbors, especially to the west of the Baltic states, with Ukraine, and even with Poland. The important thing, well, why do I say this? Because the Mongol Hans viewed the world largely as enemies or as vassals or subjects. So, for example, when the leaders or the kings of Christian or medieval Europe attempted to contact and form an alliance with the Mongols against the common enemy, the Muslims, they sent an emissary to meet with the Han to form an alliance, or at least that was the motivation forming the Western emissaries, the Catholic emissaries. But of course, the Han and the Mongols, when they received this delegation, they thought, well, these guys came to pay homage to us. They came to offer to be our slaves and to be our vassals. Why else would these wimpy Westerners come to see us? And this Mongol worldview, this view of the others, basically was emulated and was inherited by the Muscovites. So when Muscovy expanded and absorbed or conquered neighboring peoples, it basically assumed whenever it came in contact with any tribe or people that these people should naturally pledge their allegiance to the Tsar. Of course, the locals, the natives that they came in contact with, assumed, well, we're were just signing or swearing some sort of an oath or some sort of an understanding with these Muscovites as partners or as equals. This is a trade deal, or this is some sort of an alliance. Muscovites, and the Muscovites in turn saw it as the natives paying homage. So you have the same sort of when these two sides came in contact, the Muscovites had much different understanding and much different expectations than the natives. And even today, you see this played out in post-Soviet Russia's relations with countries like Ukraine and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. The Muscovites, or post-Soviet Russians, assumed that these countries should naturally agree to be vassals. They're weaker, they're smaller. How dare they assume that they are sovereign states that have the right to determine their own destiny? Now, another thing that we should remember is that there are other Orthodox Ruthenians that were liberated from the Mongol rule by the Lithuanians during the 14th century. So pretty much the same people of the same faith, same Orthodox faith, and who were integrated into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And these were the ancestors of the modern-day Ukrainians and Belarusians. And because of belonging to a completely different cultural and political organism than Muscovy, the Ukrainians and the Belarusians developed actually a much more liberty-friendly and pro-Western or Western-oriented culture than that of Muscovy Russia. So Orthodox Ruthenians frequently found themselves fighting on both sides of this clash of civilizations on the eastern borderlands of the West. So I just want to emphasize that orthodoxy by itself is not the only factor. It's not even the predominant factor in this case. And actually, the Third Rome ideology continued to influence the Tsardom's foreign policies even following Peter I's westernization of the empire during the early 18th century. Peter wanted to make Russia European and integrated his empire into the European state system. However, the impact of the anti-Western Muscovite xenophobic worldview was counterbalanced during the imperial period, so roughly 1721 to 1917, to the revolution, by the fact that the Russian elites became westernized, at least to a significant degree. So, at least partly they felt that they were part of this European state system, and they did not see themselves as doomed or as the antithesis of the West. They viewed themselves as a part of the West, even if Orthodox or more Eastern, an Eastern element, or the Eastern bastion of Europe, so to speak. Of course, this started slowly changing during the 19th century, especially the 1830s and 40s, under the impact of Slavophilism, when Russian intellectuals and the elites started rejecting the Enlightenment era rationalist sort of Occidentalism, the view that Russia is a part of Europe, should be a part of Europe, and should emulate Europe in every respect. The Slavophiles rejected this and instead posited that Russia is different, it is Eurasian, it is much more traditional and mystical and superior to the sort of Germano-Roman, overly rationalist West. But even so, until 1917, in spite of the impact of Slavophilism and in spite of many manifestations of Orthodox chauvinism, the Russian elite really still saw itself as part of the larger Western European system. And actually, I believe that Mr. Patrushev should remember that all of this changed because of the Bolsheviks, who were anti-Russian radicals transported into Russia by her enemies, the Germans, to subvert the empire's government and take Russia out of the war. So I sense some irony here, because basically a ex-KGB officer who served the Bolshevik regime is basically pontificating, castigating something that his own ideological ancestors inflicted upon Russia. Now, getting back to the Soviet factor, according to communist propaganda, Soviet Russia was the fatherland of the world's socialist revolution, standing in direct opposition to the evil and decadent capitalist imperialist powers bent on encircling and destroying her. After all, the money-grubbing exploiters in New York, London, Western capitals feared the workers and peasant state as an existential threat to their economic interests, i.e., their ability to continue exploiting the world's proletariat. Thus, exporting the revolution through force of subversion became not only the right, but indeed the obligation of the Soviet Union, even if at times it might have to be temporarily suspended for tactical reasons. In such a context, Soviet militarism and expansionism were legitimized as self-defense measures forced upon the peace-loving Marxist-Leninist state by a hostile world full of perpetually plotting enemies. After all, Lenin asserted, it is not the defensive or offensive character of the war, but the interests of the class struggle of the proletariat, or, to put it better, the interests of the international movement of the proletariat, that represent the sole criterion for deciding the attitude to any particular event in international relations. In light of such dialectical sophistry, even naked Soviet aggression, such as the invasion of Finland in late 1939, could be presented as defensive. Clearly, this Soviet propaganda Weltanschauung found fertile ground in the historical tradition of Muscovite Third Romism and Russian Occidentophobia, although we should remember that anti-Westernism was a core feature of not only Russo-Soviet communism. It is also apparent that the post-Soviet regime of Putin, Patrushev, and other Chekists has been feeding on whatever elements of both Muscovite and Soviet propaganda myths that happen to suit their needs at any particular moment, especially the drive to rebuild the Kremlin's lost empire. Thus, the specter of Nazism is resurrected in attacks against Ukraine and the Baltic states, as if Moscow was fighting the Second World War all over again. And actually, there is a joke floating around post-Soviet Russia and the post-Soviet sphere. What are Putin's two greatest achievements? One, winning the Great Patriotic War, meaning World War II. And the second achievement, sending Yuri Gagarin up into space. So, in other words, the Kremlin's leadership is still milking the victory in the so-called Great Patriotic War to further its agenda. Never mind that Putin's idol, Stalin, helped Hitler start the war by carving up Poland, the Baltics, and Romania. And never mind that pro-German sympathies and collaboration in Ukraine and the Baltic countries were in many ways the product of Soviet mass murder and terror in those lands. And, in fact, for instance, the Estonians and Latvians were very anti-German before 1940, before the Sovietization of their countries. Why? Because the German Baltic barons, who were actually one of the most loyal servants of the Russian Tsars, were seen as oppressors by the Estonian and Latvian peasants. So the sympathy for Germany was really only a post-1941 phenomenon. And peoples of the Intermarium would have welcomed basically anyone who came to deliver them from Stalin and Stalin's monstrous clutches. Simultaneously, Putin's propaganda machine depicts Russia as the champion of orthodoxy and Christian traditionalism, locked in a struggle for survival with the decadent, degenerate Judeo-Protestant Catholic West, whose aim is to spread liberalism, democracy, and the LGBT counterculture to Central Europe, Ukraine, ultimately to Russia itself. Hence, in many a Russian mind, it is once again the late 15th century, and Holy Muscovy, the last redoubt of orthodoxy, is yet again compelled to defend itself against the incursions and conspiracies of the Latin West. And actually, there is a certain kind of in the post-Soviet mind, there's a certain kind of anachronistic projection of the current conflict into the medieval sort of Catholic Orthodox conflict. So the West is not only the heir of the Teutonic Knights and the Catholic Crusaders fighting against Orthodoxy, at the same time, it's also the purveyor of LGBT liberalism and radical lifestyles. So although all these messages are logically and historically inconsistent, they are tailored for many different audiences, including Red Army and KGB veterans, Orthodox chauvinists or supremacists, Russian nationalists and imperialists, Western nationalists and conservatives, particularly of the paleo type, libertarians, pacifists and quote-unquote not interventionists, and even anti-NWO quote-unquote conspiracy theorists. Diverse target audiences have their own reasons to buy into or pretend to believe Kremlin disinformation. For example, paleo-conservatives like Pat Buchanan and European nationalists like Marine Le Pen find the traditionalist rhetoric coming from Putin more palatable than the anti-Christian, pro-LGBT cultural relativism spouted by Obama. Ron Paul-style libertarians are simply fed up with foreign wars and do not trust the U.S. government line. Being non-interventionists, as a matter of principle, they will grasp at any talking points against American involvement on behalf of Ukraine. People will often believe what they want to believe, and others yet are simply not averse to Russian money. As the ancient Romans used to say, pecunia non olet, money does not stink. The main objective of the America wants to dismember Russia and overthrow her government line is obvious: to turn the tables by turning the victims into aggressors and the invaders into victims. The irony of Patrushov's charges is, of course, that, as has happened so often throughout history, Moscow is committing precisely the same sins as it is accusing others of perpetrating. Russia's invasions of Georgia and Ukraine are clear examples of the Kremlin's attempts to dismember captive nations attempting to escape Moscow's suffocating embrace, to overthrow national governments that do not wish to be her vassals. The Intermarium peoples may also recall other such examples in Russian and Soviet history, such as the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Recent history also shows how far-fetched are Patrushov's allegations. During the 1990s, the US actually attempted to prop up post-Soviet Russia to stabilize the post-Soviet zone. In 1994, the Clinton administration convinced Ukraine to surrender its nuclear weapons inherited from the Soviet Union to Russia in exchange for Russia's recognitions of Ukraine's borders, an international agreement which Moscow obviously violated. Rather than contemplating ways to encircle and dismember Russia, America and other Westerners long to finally enjoy the end of history and the peace dividend. Those who warned that Russia would eventually attempt to reconquer its empire were dismissed as paranoid Russophobes with an anachronistic Cold War mentality. At least some in DC also seem to view Russia as a troublesome but perhaps necessary partner to help balance against the growing Chinese threat. George W. Bush started out his presidency declaring the need for firmer policies towards post-Soviet Russia, but After 9/11, a tension developed between his support for the captive nations and Bush's desire to collaborate with Putin on the anti-Islamo-terrorist front. At the end of W's presidency, Putin was able to invade Georgia without many serious consequences. In fact, Obama chose to appease the Kremlin in the name of his so-called reset, a naive policy which collapsed with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Had the United States truly pursued the strategy that Patrushev and other post-Soviet leaders attribute to it, Washington might have easily taken advantage of the internal chaos and decay in Russia during the 1990s. Instead of helping Russia, we might have pushed her further into the abyss of its own making. We might also have supported the creation of an independent Siberian Republic between the Ural Mountains and the Pacific, the centrifugal native force in the Islamic Northern Caucasus, striving to break away from the so-called Russian Federation, in reality still an empire, albeit a truncated one, and the separation from Russia of the Kaliningrad enclave, or Krulevets, or Königsberg enclave, which now serves as a loaded gun pointed at Poland, Lithuania, and other Baltic nations. Instead, we chose to err on the side of stability, and we hoped that changing times would modify and soften Russian foreign policy by magically erasing hundreds of years of expansionism and empire building. The post-Soviet regime in Moscow should be thanking America precisely and generally not taking advantage of Russia's internal chaos during the 1990s. In spite of our preference for ahistoricism, however, we must learn from the past. The Moscow-backed separatists have violated the Minsk ceasefire agreement and continue to attack the Ukrainians. If we do not wish to see Ukraine reintegrated into the Kremlin's empire, we must provide sufficient aid to the Ukrainians, including weaponry, to help them stop the separatist advance. Quote-unquote separatist, I should add. The Russians will only stop if they run into formidable resistance and are compelled to pay for every inch of captured land, price in blood and treasure that will prove prohibitive and unsustainable for them. So that is where I will end, and I suppose we'll open up the floor first for Dr. Hodakiewicz's comments and then for questions. I'll let you admire and absorb this graphic some more.
Yes, it's my feudal privilege here at the Institute to be allowed to comment. This presentation is really about a philosophical question. How do we approach an individual, a collective, including a state? What makes us and what makes us tick? This is what I gathered from Mr. Styrna's presentation. Is it legitimate to look into history? Now, mind you, I am prejudiced because I'm a historian. I can see the Armenians, and I know they'll bristle at the word Turkey. Look in the back. This is exactly what's just happened.
I see bristles.
This is exactly what's going to happen. It's almost a Pavlovian reflex with Mr. Klandakia. And if you don't know history, you will be put off, usually. What makes us? Is it just the DNA or the collective messages encoded in our psyche? How do we figure the Kremlin out? Is it warranted to draw a line from Mongol despotism and tyranny straight into the foyer of Vladimir Putin's dacha? Well, some would say yes. Others would say, yeah, it's nonsense. He is what he is, and he's interested in things right now. Look at us. Guatemala picks up with a wave of refugees. We don't like it that Guatemala has an opinion about us handling Guatemala, because what the heck is Guatemala? And how big is it? And is it relevant? A couple of years ago, China's foreign minister, deputy foreign minister at an Asia summit said, it's only natural that we're moving around as Spratleys and imposing our will because we're big, we're small. your duty is to shut up and obey. It's almost a verbatim paraphrase. So it does come, this privilege, with power. However, when Muscovy was in its crib, it had imperial pretensions, including the title of the Tsar, which means Caesar. That's a little bit, I don't know, delusional? Western Europeans had no idea what the heck they agreed to when the Habsburgs consented to addressing the ruler, the Grand Duke of Muscovy, as Caesar, because the Habsburgs had no idea what that meant, Tsar. That fed into the mindset that the denizen of the Kremlin was special. If I shall rattle my saber, you will fear me. And this has been a formula over centuries. Hey, I'm going to stage nuclear exercises. Woohoo! I'll show them how I can nuke Warsaw. This is exactly what the Kremlin is doing, but that there is a pattern, and historians don't have to, but they can relate to the pattern. President Bush Jr. infamously confessed that he looked into Vladimir Putin's eyes and saw his soul. One of our professors, Norm Bailey, who's stuck in Israel now, commented, "Oh, I didn't know Putin had a soul. Thank you very much, the floor is open."
Yes? Yes, sir.
You know, from a Russian point of view, if you do look at our bases around the world, I understand how, from a pro-American view, would put them there. But if I'm from a Russian, I would feel as though I am the encircle. In the picture 1991, really could have gone back 30 years ago. Because we literally had missile defense in the 1960s. The satellites were all primitive in the 70s. So I think from a Russian view, I think I get their fear. And if I were them, I'd probably do the same thing if they were a global power post-World War II and fell apart in the 90s. So it's a problem from our American view, but I think I understand what they're trying to do. Putin would probably try to do the same thing.
Well, I think the problem is,
Yeah,
of course. Well, the problem is that the Russians played this game of the Russians basically utter the same things that Patrushev uttered and create this impression that they feel encircled, they feel threatened, they feel surrounded, and they know very well, I think, that the West is very sensitive to that, because when we hear that, we say, "Oh my God, these guys must really feel they're pushed against the wall. We should back off a little bit because we don't want to push them doing something crazy." But I think they know exactly what they're doing. They know how to play this complex. They know how they think, and they know how to play it. I think that I think we have looked at the world from the Russian point of view more than enough. I think we've given their perspective more than enough consideration. What about looking at the world from the perspective of Russia's neighbors who feel threatened by Russia's obvious neo-imperialism? I mean, either to doubt that Putin is attempting to reassemble the empire, one either has to be pro-Russian or simply not have been paying attention the past 25 years. So, if they feel threatened, maybe they should think about developing their own economic infrastructure and developing Russia internally instead of simply attempting to expand and rebuild the empire, which actually historically was often more of a ball and chain than a benefit to them. So,
I may show you something. I can't do this, but imagine this is Russia, and your point is that from the Kremlin it can look like encirclement. turn it around, it looked like Kremlin is looking at that. In that way, it depends on your point of view. The United States maintains its bases almost exclusively in places where the American troops stopped as a result of the Second World War. And that's it. Stopped. And believe me, almost everybody in Central and Eastern Europe wishes that the American tanks stopped on Narva. The dream was, and the fantasy, to observe the conclusion of the International Socialists and the National Socialists slaughtering each other on the Eastern Front, and the American cavalry riding to the rescue all the way to Narva. The Communists, the Reds and the Browns killing each other off. That would be a dream for humanity. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. Unfortunately, Stalin thrust deep into Europe and caused enormous harm and death on top of what Hitler read. Well, we should have taken Hitler out of it in the 20s, but it's just, I'm a historian. You guys, I have a list, but those people are not famous yet.
Gentlemen, I have a question. Where
It's
do
okay.
we go from here? I mean, let's say that the Besieged complex is a reality, or it's certainly a propaganda
Sure.
machine. I spent a lot of time in Europe. I served on the board of directors of 3 very large public companies over there. When you talk to Europeans, Western Europeans, they are not sympathetic to American intervention at all. And the public is not sympathetic to American intervention at all. When you look at expenditures for NATO, all of them are massively underspending. So,
Yeah.
what do you believe is the probability, given the historical weakness of the Obama administration vis-a-vis Putin, that Putin, in these waning months of the Obama administration, will make a major offensive move in the Ukraine? And what will the likely US/NATO response ultimately be? And will that response be effective given the current state of NATO readiness? And
Wow.
given the enormous pacifist resistance of the Western European public? Those are my 3 questions.
Well, I think the probability, I mean, unfortunately, the reality is that most likely Putin will, take advantage of these waning years of the Obama administration because he knows that this is a window of time, the only window of time that he can do this. So he will attempt to expand his sphere of influence, his power in Ukraine as much as possible. So I fear that the Russians will make greater gains, and if they do, and when they do, I fear that the Obama administration will just continue, its sort of token assistance combined with rhetorical support and in general just providing very little that is too late, and the Western Europeans will simply prefer another Munich because to them Ukraine is not worth it. So I think this will only change once there's a new administration in the White House in January 2017. But by then, most likely, the situation will be much worse in Ukraine than it is even now, and it's already bad. So what we should be doing is a different ball game than from what will likely happen, unfortunately. So, not sure if that.
Crystal ball gazing is very difficult.
Yeah.
I know.
To a large extent,
Yes.
Putin is an opportunist.
Right.
So, a very violent move, in my opinion, would be counterintuitive. More subversion, more green men, more active measures, more intel operations and propaganda operations, that's in the cards. I don't think a Marshal Zhukov-like surge of T-34s. They still have them, and sometimes they show up in Ukraine, eastern Ukraine. I don't think that's particularly likely. One never knows, but there are convoys still going to Transnistria, to Moldova. Why? Is it a show of force? Yes, that's swaggering, a tool of statecraft. My main concern, however, is the cohesiveness and lack of solidarity, lack of cohesiveness of the Western alliance. Until the United States, and I'm sure not this administration, learns how to appeal to Western Europeans in terms of common security, and learns how to tie the crisis Western Europe, or actually Southern and Southwestern Europe faces on its doorsteps, and tie it to similar predicament and concerns. In the East, nothing's going to happen. I've spoken many times. Last time, about half a year ago, in Wiesbaden, I was invited by G2 Europe to talk about those issues. There is absolutely no cognizance on the part of the Estonians that the lines of Spain have been breached. And the Latvians don't give a hoot that there are massive landings in Italy. By the same token, neither the Italians nor the Spaniards nor the French give a damn about anything that's happening in Ukraine. Well, the only force capable of anything is the United States of America. But for this, we would have to have leadership. Last I checked, Alexander the Great scaled the walls by himself. The current Alexander wannabe is sipping his latte on Harvard Square, and the only bad thing that ever happens to him is when I walk by, his milk curdles.
Yes, sir.
I'm just interested, because it's kind of more hypothetical, how the Kremlin policy changed with the opening of the Arctic oceans? Because I guess like 50 years now, like will it feel less backed up? They have a lot more warm water ports. It will probably feel a lot more warm water ports.
Well, I mean, I don't think it will change for the better because, one, I'm not a cultural determinist, but I think culture and history are a key factor here. So and opening up the Arctic or what any other option like that will not really change the centuries of history and historical experiences and traditions. So plus there's also the emotive factor, meaning for the Russians, Ukraine is Russian soil, same as Belarus. So that will continue to be very important for them, much more important than the Arctic or anything else. So the way they see Ukraine is like the Americans see New York or Massachusetts, looking at it from their perspective. So I don't think that's really going to change much, especially for the better. Yes, sir.
I was going to point out that on the Arctic issue, several of the Arctic nations have been talking to each other, and the Kremlin's already stated that they have a policy looking to put tolls on the waterways when they eventually open up, because they consider them to be defensive territory of their national sovereignty, and access will be limited because it could threaten their vital national security. So that should already give you an indication of where they lead, should that actually occur.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
How large, two questions, how large is the Russian army? And the second question is, how much is that deployed on the Chinese border? I remember talking with a Russian several years ago, since he was from Russia with the archives. Their fear is China taking over Siberia long term, just because the population of Russia has moved west of the Ural Mountains. Siberia is wide open for the Chinese.
Yeah. Well, I'm not really an expert on the military by itself, so I can't really tell you how much is stationed on the Chinese border. I believe the Russian army right now is more or less, I think, 1 million strong. So it's down from the strength of the Soviet army, which was like 5 point something million, but but we shouldn't just be looking at the numbers, because they are attempting to convert their army to a much more professional, high-tech force that's oriented towards special operations, and the spearhead of which is special forces. A lot of the troops fighting, I believe most of the Russian troops fighting as quote-unquote separatists in Ukraine are actually special forces, Spetsnaz and other such units. So as far as the Chinese threat, I mean, there are different schools, there are different approaches to that. I'm sure that they fear China and China's demographic potential and the threat that China will pose if it continues to develop as robustly as it does. But so far, the Chinese and the Russians have managed to collaborate without too many problems, simply because they are both more anti-American than either of them are, than the Russians being anti-Chinese or the Chinese being anti-Russian. So they distrust and dislike us more than they dislike and distrust each other. Now, I haven't completely bought into the old Golitsyn, theory, sort of quasi-conspiracy theory that the Sino-Soviet split was fake, or at least, well, he said basically he was a KGB defector who said that it was real in the beginning, but later they patched things up, but they continued to operate as if it was real to basically fool the West. I haven't bought into that, but to some degree, I think that they do try to manipulate the West by, attempting to convince us or implying that they are more afraid of each other than they are of us. So, why? Because, well, if we believe that Russia is so afraid of China, then we would be willing to maybe, we would be willing to work with the Russians and maybe pay a price for maybe an alliance of sorts against the Chinese, or vice versa. So it's really a way to squeeze concessions from the West by pretending to be enemies. But in the long run, again, it's hard to look at the read the crystal ball. But right now, the Chinese are happy that there is a crisis in Ukraine because they have their own. They're pretty much doing the same thing in the South China Sea. So they're happy to have the world's attention away from the South China Sea and gazing at Ukraine and ISIS in the Middle East. And also, so far, it looks like they've managed to share influence in Central Asia fairly well. That would be a big potential conflict spot because I don't think China really wants Russia to regain complete influence of Central Asia, nor does Russia want China to establish complete dominance of Central Asia. But if they have sort of a unwritten, implied co-dominion, meaning 50-50, they have a sort of 50-50 sphere of influence, they share influence, then, if they manage to adhere to that, then there isn't going to be a conflict between the two. So just to sum it up, I don't really foresee a major Russo-Chinese conflict at this point, and I think that the Russians are fairly secure that the Chinese are not going to invade Siberia, although in the long run, they, given their demographic situation, I'm sure that they're afraid of China in the long run. And by the way, the whole Ukraine attempt to gobble up Ukraine is also an attempt to fix their demographic problem. They've believed that about a year ago they've managed to stop the demographic decline, but they're not sure for how long. And Ukraine is about 40 million. fellow Eastern Orthodox Slavs, so they believe that maybe if they resubjugate them, they can turn them into Russians, hopefully, maybe, and they think that will at least remedy their demographic problem to some degree. But yeah, sorry for the long answer, but there are many tangents that are important to address. Yes, sir?
Taking in consideration that Russia is trying to rebuild its empire, what stopped them from completely annexing Georgia and Ukraine?
Well, because basically Putin is a very calculating individual. He's not reckless. He's been often compared to Hitler, but the difference is that Hitler was a risk taker. He was a gambler. So Putin is more of a methodical, cunning player who, basically bites off a small chunk and sees what happens. And if there's no reaction, then he keeps biting off more, and he waits for the reaction. Then, basically, step by step, salami tactics. He basically tries to slice off a piece of the salami at a time. Also in Georgia, I believe he wasn't really quite ready, or he wasn't sure whether he wants to annex Georgia outright. He wanted to control Abkhazia and South Ossetia, but also you have to keep in mind that the Russians are, well, there's a certain prejudice towards people from the Caucasus and from Central Asia. So they may not want to have those people integrated directly into the empire, so because they don't want them coming to Moscow and St. Petersburg. So they'd like to have some sort of a border keeping them in their localities. However, they'd like to dominate them, have hegemony over them anyway, so perhaps some sort of indirect rule. So yeah, I don't think Putin really had a clear plan of what to do. And two, he was proceeding, it was sort of a wait and see policy. We'll see what happens. And not much happened, so he tried it in Ukraine, and again, he saw that not much happened. He bit off Crimea, not really much of a reaction, so he went after the Donbass. And finally, I don't think that the Russians want to integrate every part of the former empire into the empire on the same terms. Some parts that are maybe Eastern Slavic and Orthodox, they can be reintegrated directly. Other parts that are not, that are more foreign culturally, perhaps sort of geopolitical, military hegemony would be sufficient. So.
Also, this is a very good question. It shows you the Kremlin's method. Step number one is to fix Russia. In the 1990s, the narrative goes Russia was prostate, it was raped, the greatest theft in history. I think over $900 billion worth of properties and companies changed hands for about $8 billion. There was a Western cultural invasion. This is the narrative in the Kremlin. And the first task that Putin set up for himself was to change that. Stop the nonsense in Russia. Put paid to the might of the oligarchs, who are not his people. And that was taken care of. The second one is to put the fear of God into upstarts such as Georgians or Ukrainians. You thought you were going to join what? NATO? Okay, I'll invade you. And then you go back to the year and the month when Georgia was invaded. Most editorials, including in the Wall Street Journal, were, it was the Georgians who invaded, and then the Russians reacted. I'm sorry, I think it was the 42nd 2-man tank division can't mobilize to put on war footings a tank division, send it across the mountains into Georgia in 2 days. It's just impossible. Unless it was all on war footing, ready to go, and the Kremlin played with a provocation, that's just not possible, technically speaking. And then a year later, Putin said, ha 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 ha, we got him because we wanted them to behave the way they did, and then we could do whatever we wanted. So right now we are at the stage of psychological warfare. Again, I'll be boring as a historian. It took the Russian Empire almost 100 years to take down the Bolshevik Commonwealth. The partitions of Poland were incremental. There was coalition building. The pivot was the Berlin-Moscow axis. And it is only now slowly coming into view again, a cozy relationship because of the absence of America's leadership. So it will take a very long time. The Muscovites never ever do anything abruptly. They are very deliberate, they play the game, and the people who observe them very closely and will never get a byline in any of the newspapers say this: oh my God, I wish America had a leader like this. He is good, I mean, he's evil, but he's good. He knows how to play the game. He's a scary guy with a Russian accent.
Yes, sir.
We have a show that IWP explaining foreign policy on YouTube.
Or even network television.
Yeah.
Instead of the biggest loser be the biggest winner, really. Do they stand as treaty violators? Maybe as far back as mid 2013, with rumors, speaking of bylines, rumors in some stores with blind quotes about missile tests along the Kamchatka Peninsula. There's some talk about them having violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the ABM treaty. Is that so? And even as recently as medium range ballistic missile tests.
Well, I'm not a specialist on that, so I can't tell you that. But as far as treaty violations, what I can tell you is that they did violate the Budapest Memorandum on Security from 1994, which was the nukes for sovereignty deal. Ukraine gives up its nuclear weapons, Soviet nuclear weapons. It had the second largest, actually, arsenal after the Russian Federation within the Soviet Union, in return for Russian guarantees of Ukraine's borders and sovereignty. So they did violate that. And that should be the treaty basis for post-conflict settlement. The West should be insisting that the Budapest Memorandum be honored. Or then perhaps, if not Ukraine, then maybe some country in the intermarium can maybe we'll allow them to have nukes, such as Poland. Maybe Poland needs a nuke. We should consider that, and we should play hardball with the Russians because they play hardball, and we should not be falling for their psychological operations and their attempts to basically psych us out, so to speak. Ooh, we have to step back because they feel threatened. No, we should not succumb to that sort of reflex. That's the game they want us to play. We have to be firm. That's what we have to do, and we have to insist on. We really have to pressure them, and we have to use the Budapest Memorandum as the treaty basis for resolving the current conflict. Yes.
What are some examples that we can do to counter Russian aggression other than arming the Ukrainians, or is that our only avenue at this point?
Well, I mean, there are many. That one is, arming the Ukrainians, I think, is that's the hard power element. We should be using, first of all, we should be using, public diplomacy. We should be, which basically we sort of gave up on after the end of the Cold War because we figured the Cold War is over. Forget about it. But we should have basically a public diplomacy strategy aimed at that whole region, including Russia. And the message should be basically that the Americans are not your enemies. We are not anti-Russian, and we have to present our case. We have to present our case and the Western case to the Russian public so that they have an alternative viewpoint to go on other than what the paranoid stuff that their regime peddles to them. So as far as Ukraine, Baltics, Poland, the Intermarium, our message, should be to basically, we have to recover face. We have to save some face because that part of the world increasingly distrusts us and believes that they'll be left to their own devices if they stand up to Russia. So why not just patch things up with Russia and accommodate and bandwagon with the strong, the big guys, Russia, the aggressor, then await, American assistance, which might come or might not, and increasingly they believe it might not. So we have to reassure them, the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Balts, that we will support them, but we have to mean it. Because in 1956, for instance, the Hungarians were getting the message from West American public diplomacy, from American broadcasts, which used, of course, Hungarian anti-communist emigres. The message was, we support you, we support your resistance against the Soviet communist occupation. But in the end, that was not official policy. So we left them in the lurch, and they felt abandoned, and rightly so. So we have to be consistent. We have to make up our minds whether we want to be involved in that part of the world, and if we do, then we have to back up our words with actions, and if we don't, then we should be honest enough to tell them, hey, guys, sorry, we don't think you're worth our blood and treasure. We have other problems in the world. We got to deal with ISIS or China or whatever. We really couldn't care less whether the Ukrainian-Russian border is, by Mariupol or on the Dnieper or on the Polish border. Sorry guys, you're on your own. Don't count on us. The worst thing is to keep them, to keep them in the situation that they are in right now. We promise a lot, but we do very little, and that's the worst of both worlds. So, as far as weapons go, the reason why I stressed that approach is that the Russians have to pay a heavy price, and the only way we can hit their economy, we can tighten up sanctions, but the problem is that they're willing to pay a very, very heavy price because this isn't about money for them, at least not primarily. It really is about historical and emotional factors. It really is about rebuilding the empire and the fact that post-Soviet Russian, national identity is so intertwined with imperial greatness and it doesn't matter that we're poor and that we're eating grass or that we're dying at age 56 of drinking too much vodka, as long as the world is afraid of us and we're a big, strong empire with a large nuclear arsenal, and others are afraid of us, and these Ukrainians and Poles and Georgians and all these little nations and upstarts are afraid of us and are bowing to us, then everything's fine. We'll eat grass. So other than that, of course, we have to be, if we're serious about deterring Russia and about salvaging that part of the world and stopping this imperial reconstruction, then we also have to get involved in coalition and alliance building. We really, there is NATO, of course, but as someone mentioned earlier on, especially the Western European powers, especially the French, the Germans, the Spaniards, the Italians, really don't care much. They don't want to antagonize the Russians, and they will put the brakes on. They're likely to put the brakes on any NATO policy. So perhaps we should be thinking of a smaller but tighter combination, geopolitical military combination, both within and without NATO. So the US, the Brits, the Scandinavians, the intermaritime countries, Poland, the Baltics, Romania, and countries in the Caucasus, Georgia. We should even be tempting to bring the Central Asian stands into our coalition. So that would be sort of a containment strategy. So many things that we could be doing. Yes. Sure.
You're absolutely right. There are violations. They've just unveiled a new generation of missiles that has been consistently the case back in the 1990s. Some people who cared about that who testified before the Congress that the Russian Federation was taking our money, taxpayers' money, which were earmarked to destroy the nuclear weapons. Instead, they used the money to build a new generation of nuclear weapons. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans wanted to listen because they called it the national security siesta. And then we wake up with our head in a bedpan 10 years later or 20 years later, and we're freaked out. It's not like history stops. It just constantly goes on. Russia, hey, the end of apartheid, the end of communism, we can just sit down in Hawaii on the beach and hang out. No, it never stops. It just never stops. It doesn't mean you have to be paranoid, but those who are interested in their children and grandchildren and say civil service to this country seriously must pay attention.
And it can be a good thing.
And it could be, yes, it's definitely a good thing. Yes. Anyway, I think one